Maria, great to have you here on the program. I wish it was under better circumstances, but when I look at a law like this, and I think this doesn't just apply to the folks who are in Ghana at one particular time, but even Ghanaians who are maybe traveling abroad, and if they're found to be engaging in behavior that violates this law, they can face repercussions.
Yeah, this is one of the aspects of this law that makes it really one of the most horrifying proposals in the world right now. And that is in the context where we see a lot of countries implementing these kinds of laws that go way beyond the sort of colonial era bans on same-sex relations into much more around identity or advocacy and infringing on people's freedom of expression and freedom of assembly and all basic human rights, really.
There's also sort of the overarching tone that this sets as well. Even if somebody doesn't find themselves within sort of the legal confines of breaking this law, there is a tone here that homosexuality, certain types of gender identities just aren't acceptable. And I would think that that would also bring certain repercussions outside the bounds of legality.
Yeah, I mean, this law was proposed in 2021. And Outright launched a research program together with Ghanaian groups at the time to document what was the effects of a law that at the time had not even been introduced in Parliament. And what we documented was that we saw an increase in violence. We saw people being arbitrarily arrested. Under a law that at the time didn't even exist. We saw people being exposed to blackmail, losing their housing, really a lot of very severe consequences. And I think this is also, we've also seen this in the case of Uganda, for example, that has a somewhat similar law, that it's not necessarily just what the state wants to do and how they want to implement the law. The effects of the law are much more wide-reaching than that, and it has a very severe effect on people living there.
Right, and you can see right now we have a map there showing African nations with LGBTQ plus jail terms, and it really speaks to how neighboring countries' policies may be influencing each other. You have Gabon, Angola, and Botswana that have decriminalized homosexuality, but then on the other hand, Kenya, Namibia, Tanzania, and Niger are considering introducing legislation that deepens anti-homosexual discrimination. And then, of course, you mentioned what happened in Uganda. Can you talk a little bit more about Uganda specifically, because in 2014 they passed that legislation and then subsequently it was altered. Parts of it were revoked.
Yeah, so in 2014 the law was actually overturned on technicalities. And so in the last couple of years it's been reintroduced and then passed last year. And we have called this the worst anti-LGBTQ law in the world. And we consider this to be a law that's based on genocidal ideology. So it's not just about banning particular things that people do. It's really about trying to erase a minority from the country in its entirety. And I think that is one of the things that we're seeing with some of these laws now, that they go so much further than punishing same-sex relations. It's really much more about the way that you're allowed to express yourself. And one of the things that was overturned, there is an ongoing court case really in Uganda, but the Constitutional Court removed the provision that everyone had a duty to report people. But that is a provision that does exist in the Ghanaian law as it stands. So really, if you know someone who is LGBTQ, you are supposed to report them. And actually, in the worst situation in the Ghanaian law is it actually would apply to allies too. So it's like it's criminalizing a lot of people in society, just trying to really erase LGBTQ people.
Now, so far, this has not been signed into law by the current president, though I believe his term ends at the end of this year, so it's not clear what will happen next. In terms of the history of this bill, a lot of people are saying it can be traced back to a U.S.-based organization.
Yeah, so the World Congress of Family, which is a U.S.-based designated as a hate group at Southern Poverty Law Center, they held a conference in Ghana in 2019. And so it was after this that this bill was introduced. And, it was clear from what was known at the time that the anti-LGBTQ was high on their agenda. And I think this is what we're seeing. This isn't just something that's happening in one country or another. Like, countries are clearly inspiring and looking to each other for inspiration when it comes to these laws. And I mean, that's why we haven't just seen this in Africa. We've seen Russia pass similar laws, Iraq. Like, we have seen many places in the world pass these kinds of very far-reaching laws that have a huge impact.
I am curious. I mean, particularly when we talk about some of these U.S. groups that have been involved in this, but even some of the groups that are maybe more homegrown to those countries, the argument that they've made is that us, the U.S., the West overall, is basically forcing our values on them. That basically just because we may feel we want to be more inclusive for all people doesn't necessarily mean that they have to. How do you respond to that?
I mean, first of all, LGBTIQ people exist everywhere in the world and have since the beginning of time. Mm-hmm. And I mean, there are around 65 countries that criminalize same-sex relations. And that was actually mostly the British Empire that during colonization imposed this on countries. And so I would say that it's actually the homophobia and transphobia that has been, unfortunately, a very successful export of the West. And the way that we work it outright is always work in partnerships with groups in country. And clearly, people need and should have their rights everywhere.